Diogo Alves, Murder, Myth, and the Head in the Jar. Some people are remembered not for what they did, but for what others needed them to become. Diogo Alves sits uneasily between these two things. He was a real man, a real murderer, arrested in Lisbon, tried, convicted, and hanged in 1841. But the version of him that survived in public memory became something larger and darker than the record can safely support. The so-called killer of the Águas Livres Aqueduct, a man said to have robbed and thrown dozens of victims to their death before doctors preserved his severed head and tried to locate evil in the shape of his skull. It is one of those stories that seems almost too perfectly arranged to die, and that's exactly why it has to be told carefully. Because the truth is not that Diogo Alves was innocent and slandered by rumor. He wasn't. He was guilty of real violence, and people died because of him. The problem is different. The problem is that the most famous version of his story appears to be, in key respects, a later construction. The historical Alves and the legendary Alves overlap, but they are not the same man. Very little is known with confidence about his early life. He was likely born around 1810 in Galicia, Spain, and, like many other Galicians of the period, eventually migrated to Lisbon in search of work. Some recent reconstructions describe him as first a low-level domestic servant and later as a coachman, a more trusted and respectable position that brought him into contact with wealthier households. There are also later accounts linking him to an innkeeper named Gertrudis Maria, known as Pajarinha, and describing gambling, drinking, and financial decline as part of a slide into organized crime. Those details fit the kind of criminal descent later writers like to narrate, and some of them may be true, but the safest ground is still narrow. Galicia, migration, work in Lisbon, then criminality. The deeper biographical architecture is not strong enough to pretend we possess a fully documented early life. Now that matters because people almost always want an origin story for violence. They want childhood signs, a single trigger, a moment when the future murderer first appears in miniature. In Alves's case, the surviving record does not really allow that. There's not enough reliable material to build a modern psychological profile from youth onward. The most one can say with confidence is that by the end of the 1830s, he appears to have been operating in criminal circles and leading or helping lead a violent gang. Some later descriptions portray him as a man who became increasingly brutal, petty, and cash-driven. That may capture something true about the adult offender, but it is not the same as knowing his formative psychology. The honest version of the story leaves that uncertainty in place. Where the legend usually begins is not in the city, but above it. Lisbon I'm talking about. The Águas Livres Aqueduct had already accumulated fear before Diogo Alves was turned into its phantom. It was a monumental structure, but also an exposed and lonely one, and in popular memory it became associated with death, including suicides and unexplained falls. That atmosphere matters. It helps to explain how the legend later took hold so easily. If a place already carries dread, a real criminal can become its perfect inhabitant in retrospect, whether or not the evidence truly puts him there. According to the popular story, Alves hid along the aqueduct walkway, ambushed farmers, laborers, and other passers-by as they returned from Lisbon with money in their pockets, robbed them and hurled them over the edge. In the most repeated version, he killed more than 70 people this way between 1836 and 1839, and the authorities at first treated these deaths as suicides or unexplained falls. It is a strong story. It's a sad story, it's a gruesome story. It is also part of the Alves legend least supported by the surviving contemporary legal record. Recent archival work argues that Diogo Alves was never tried, charged, or even formally suspected during his lifetime for a campaign of aqueduct murders. The famous body count appears to be a later invention as well. The Aqueduct Murderer persona was built after his death, not established in court while he was still alive. That point is the hinge of the whole case, because once you remove the certainty of the aqueduct myth, the actual crime for which he died comes into focus, and it is terrible enough on its own. The historically grounded center of the story is the Rua das Flores massacre in 1839 in Lisbon's Chiado district. The house belonged to Dr. Pedro de Andrade, a wealthy and prominent physician. On the night of the crime, Andrade was away. In the home remained the family of his housekeeper, Maria da Conceição Correa Mourão. Recent reconstructions describe the household gathered around a celebratory meal because Maria's son, José Elias Correa Mourão, had just returned from a voyage. If that detail is correct, then what happened next becomes even more brutal, not simply a robbery, but the destruction of a family assembled in a moment of happiness. The victims who matter most in this story need to be named: Maria da Conceição Correa Mourão, her son, José Elias Correa Mourão, her daughters, Amelia and Viciencia Mourão, and Manuel Alves, a servant linked to the household, later killed as part of a cover-up. These are the 5 deaths most securely tied to the case that actually sent Alves to the gallows. That is one of the reasons they should not disappear behind the grander aqueduct myth. However many later deaths folklore attached to his name, these are the people for whom the historical case against him is strongest. According to the later reconstruction now reflected in recent summaries, the gang gained entry with help from Manuel Alves, who acted as an insider. Once inside, the robbery became a massacre. The victims were bound, beaten, and killed with appalling violence. Recent accounts describe smashed skulls, crushed chests, and a crime scene discovered the next morning in chaos near an overturned dining table. Afterward, the gang killed Manuel Alves as well, apparently to remove a witness and seal the crime. This is the documented darkness at the center of Alves's life. Not a lone bridge phantom, but gang violence, domestic invasion, and the murder of multiple people in one private home. And this distinction matters for more than just accuracy. It changes the emotional shape of the story. The legend gives you a theatrical predator above Lisbon, almost folkloric in his isolation. The documented case gives you something uglier and more believable, a violent offender operating with accomplices, exploiting access, invading a home, and killing in a setting where trust should have protected the victims, but did not. That version is less Hollywood and more serious. It is also, in moral terms, enough. Diogo Alves does not need 70 victims to be horrifying. The reaction to the Rua das Flores murders also reveals something about the society around the case. The aqueduct deaths, if they occurred as a broader social phenomenon of falls and suicides, did not provoke the same decisive machinery. But the slaughter of people inside the home of a respected physician struck directly at elite security and urban order. This time the response was swift. Alves was arrested on October 29, 1839. He was prosecuted for the Rua das Flores murders and the killing of Manuel Alves. And unlike the mythic aqueduct campaign, these crimes were concrete enough to carry him to conviction and death. If you wanted the neatest possible timeline, it would look like this and would look simple. Around 1810, Diogo Alves is born in Galicia. At some point while still young, he migrates to Lisbon. He works first in domestic service, then as a coachman. By the late 1830s, he is linked to criminal company and to Gertrudis Maria. In 1839, the Rua das Flores home invasion murders take place. On October 29, 1839, Alves is arrested. He is tried, convicted, and sentenced to death. And on the 19th of February in 1841, he is executed by hanging at Cais do Tojo in Lisbon. A great deal of the rest is myth, imaginative embellishment, expansion, and afterlife. One of the oldest surviving distortions is the claim that Alves was the last man hanged in Portugal, or even the last person executed there. He wasn't. This is one of those details that sounds right because it fits the legend's neatness. But historically, it is false. Another man, Francisco de Matos Lobo, was hanged in April 1842, more than a year after Alves's death. Civil executions continued in Portugal until 1846, and the legal abolition of capital punishment for civil crimes did not come until 1867. So, put simply, Alves was one of the last people Portugal executed, but he certainly wasn't the last one. And then there is the head in the jar. No part of the Alves legend has done more to preserve him, no pun intended, put a pin in that one for a few moments later, in the public imagination than the image of a severed human head floating in a glass jar at the Faculty of Medicine in the University of Lisbon. Visitors have long been told, and the institution itself has publicly echoed, that this is the head of Diogo Alves. For many people, that jar seems to prove everything else. It appears to connect crime, punishment, science, and relic in one object. A man kills, the state hangs him, science preserves him, and history puts him on display. It's almost too perfect. But that is where the story starts coming apart under scrutiny. The popular version says that the head was preserved in formaldehyde, you can now unpin the pun, soon after Alves's execution in 1841, so doctors and phrenologists could study the physical seat of his criminality. In other words, they wanted to study the shape of his skull because back then there was a pseudoscience that I just mentioned called phrenology that said that a person's head shape had to do with their impulses, their intelligence, and a whole host of other things. Thankfully, that was debunked centuries ago. Another big problem we have is that the formaldehyde timeline makes little to no sense. Formaldehyde's history as a practical tissue fixative belongs much later in the 19th century, not to 1841. The kind of preservation associated with the specimen now shown in Lisbon does not fit comfortably with the chemistry available at the time of Diogo's death. That alone does not prove the jarred head cannot be his, but it makes the standard story much less credible than people assume. The second problem is physical. Recent argument holds that the preserved head does not closely match contemporary depictions of Alves. Again, that is not absolute proof by itself. Portraiture can be imperfect, and old engravings are not photographs. What it does, though, is that it adds to the weight of doubt rather than relieving it. The third problem is perhaps the most important. The specimen historically tied most clearly to the scientific study of Alves appears not to have been a fleshy preserved head in liquid at all, but a bare skull. Recent summaries of the new research say that later anthropological work, including the writings of Francisco Ferraz de Macedo, dealt with an osteological specimen, the study of bones, a skull, not the famous wet specimen that now captures tourists and journalists. That is a major difference. It suggests that public memory may have conflated two things, the real historical study of remains associated with Alves and a different preserved anatomical specimen later labeled as his. And then there is the archival gap. The destruction associated with the 1978 Museu Bocage fire reportedly damaged institutional collections and catalog records. Once that chain of custody weakened, the conditions were perfect for a legend to settle where documentation had fallen away. In that vacuum, an anonymous or a misidentified specimen could become, through repetition, the head of Diogo Alves. The myth did not need fraud to survive. It only needed lost paperwork, institutional drift, and a story people badly wanted to keep telling. This is where the scientific side of the story has to be narrated carefully. Yeah, 19th century Europe and America was deeply interested in reading criminality from anatomy. Phrenology and related pseudoscientific traditions absolutely tried to locate vice, intelligence, and violence in the contours of the skull. So the idea that a notorious criminal's remains might attract medical attention is absolutely historically plausible. But the stronger version of the story is not doctors preserved Diogo Alves' head in a jar and studied evil. The stronger, safer version is this. The Alves legend became attached to 19th century efforts to anatomize criminality, but the famous preserved head now shown to visitors is very likely misidentified, and the historically documented scientific object was more probably a skull. That may sound like a narrowing of the story, but in truth it makes the whole thing more interesting. Because once you strip away the conveniences of legend, what remains is not smaller. It is just stranger. A real murderer existed. A real family was destroyed. A real execution took place. Real, later writers transformed him into the Aqueduct Murderer. and a real anatomical object, perhaps not even his, helped turn that transformation into something that looked tangible and scientific. That transformation can actually be traced. Cheap print literature, later sensational compilations, travel writing, and eventually the 1911 silent film Os Crimes de Diogo Alves. Sorry, had to try the Portuguese pronunciation at least once. Helped fix the aqueduct myth in Portuguese cultural memory. Once that happened, the legend became self-reinforcing. The city had its monster. The aqueduct had its murderer. The jar had its criminal. Later generations inherited a ready-made narrative and repeated it until it sounded older and firmer than it really was. And that's why some skepticism is important here. One of the most damaging things a legend can do is absorb real people into decorative horror. Once Alves becomes the aqueduct killer in the abstract, the real victims risk disappearing into a tangle of embellishment, mistakes, and other errors. And that would be the wrong center of gravity. Now, let's summarize. He was likely born around 1810 in Galicia and moved to Lisbon as a young man. He worked in legitimate service before falling into criminal life. By 1839, he was involved in the violent home invasion massacre at Rua das Flores, in the house of Dr. Pedro de Andrade, where Maria de Conceição Correa Mourão, José Elias Correa Mourão, Amelia Mourão, Viciencia Mourão, and Manuel Alves were killed. He was arrested on the 29th of October in 1839, convicted for those murders, and hanged on the 19th of February, 1841, at Caes de Tojo. The famous story that he murdered scores of people from the Águas Livres Aqueduct appears to be a posthumous cultural construction, not a charge proved against him in court. And the famous preserved head at the University of Lisbon has long been identified as his, but recent historical work strongly suggests that the identification is wrong, or, at the very least, far less certain than popular retelling implies. That is not a diminished story. It is a more real one, because it reveals not only a murderer, but the machinery that builds murderers into myths. A city accumulates fear around a place. A real criminal is captured and executed. Popular literature fuses him into unsolved dread. Science, or something that looks like science, adds a relic. And then culture does what culture always does. It smooths the contradiction away and leaves one unforgettable image where there were once many uncertain parts. And that's exactly why the myth of Diogo still endures. Not just because of what he did, though what he did was horrible enough. And not just because of the head in the jar, though that image has done enormous work for the legend. He lingers because his story lives at that junction of real violence, social fear, lost records, bad science, and the human need to believe that evil can be pinned to a single face and preserved forever. But real history is rarely that neat. Okay, I just wanted to say a couple of things now that I've finished the story. If any Portuguese speakers listen to this video, I just want to apologize for accidentally butchering your place names and phrases and everything. I wasn't going to try to speak in one of your accents for the entire video because obviously that wouldn't work, and I know American English doesn't necessarily articulate Portuguese phrases properly, so I tried my best. If I got anything wrong, I apologize. And to everybody, thank you for listening. Really, I do appreciate it. And if you like this material, please consider subscribing. I'll be trying to put out 1 or 2 videos every week if I have the time. It's fun, and yeah, I hope you stick around. Thanks. Have a good one.